In the spring of 1990, a man named Walter had a retirement party in a break room. Sheet cake, paper plates, a card everybody signed. 30 years at the same company, and they handed him a gold watch and a pension, $30,000 a year for the rest of his life. Nobody in that room thought Walter had hit the jackpot. $30,000. It was a fine, respectable, ordinary number, the kind of pension a regular guy earned by showing up for 30 years. His coworker shook his hand and went back to work, and Walter drove home to start his retirement. Now put Walter's son Danny at his own dining table today, with a retirement statement, a calculator, and a coffee going cold beside him. Danny is retiring this year. And if Danny wanted to walk into his retirement with exactly what his father had, the same life, the same security, the same everything, he would need somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.5 million saved up. Some ways of counting it, closer to $2 million. That's not a typo. What Walter got for showing up to work, his son would need roughly $2 million to buy. So we're going to walk through exactly how that's possible, step by step, with the real math, no hand-waving. You'll see how that pension was actually built, the 4 things it carried that have since vanished from most retirements, and the accounting rule, signed the very year Walter retired, that helped kill the whole arrangement. And I'll be honest with you along the way, including about where the headline overshoots. Stay with me to the end, because I'll also tell you why not every pension from 1990 was the treasure people remember, what to do if someone ever offers to buy yours out, and what all of this means if you're holding one right now. But first, let's get our bearings, because to understand what Walter had, you have to remember the world he was standing in. In 1990, the median American home was worth about $79,000. Gas ran a little over $1 a gallon. The minimum wage was $3.80 an hour. A year at a 4-year public university, tuition, room, and board, everything cost about $5,200. And the median American family, a whole household, often 2 working adults, earned about $35,300 a year. Now put Walter's pension next to that last number. His pension alone, for the rest of his life, was about 85% of what an entire working American family earned. He could have bought the median American home outright with less than 3 years of pension checks. He wasn't rich, but he had, without lifting a finger, an income that put him within shouting distance of a full working household. And remember, that was on top of Social Security. Walter's actual retirement income was his pension plus his Social Security check, which means, in the world of 1990, Walter and his wife were living better in retirement than the average family down the street was living, while working full-time. That's what a modest pension meant. That's the thing that got him sheet cake and a handshake. Here's where we're headed. First, how these pensions were actually calculated, because the formula explains a lot, including the hidden price Walter paid. Then the plain inflation math, and I'll tell you right now, it does not get you to $100,000. And I'm not going to pretend it does. Then the 4 things Walter's pension carried that money alone can't buy, and that's where the number really takes off. Then the lump sum reveal, which is the figure that'll stop you cold. Then the story of how it all disappeared. And finally, the honest other side, because nostalgia is a liar, and plenty of 1990 pensions turned out to be far less golden than people remember. Let's look under the hood, because almost nobody knows how these things were calculated, and the formula tells you everything. A traditional pension, the experts call it a defined benefit plan, meaning the benefit is defined and guaranteed up front. Usually ran on a simple formula with 3 ingredients. Your years of service times a small percentage called the multiplier, times your final salary. That's it. So Walter's looked like this. 30 years of service, a 2% multiplier, a common figure, and a final salary of about $50,000. 30 times 2% is 60%. 60% of $50,000 is $30,000 a year, for life. That's where the number came from. It wasn't a pile of money that grew in an account somewhere. It was a promise, calculated with a formula, and the company was on the hook to honor it until the day Walter died. Now notice something important hiding in that formula, because it explains a great deal about that generation. The multiplier applies to your final salary, not what you earned at 25, but what you earned at the end, at your peak. which means the last decade of Walter's career was worth vastly more than the first. 10 years in, he'd earned about $10,000 a year. 20 years in, $20,000. It was only by grinding out that final stretch, at his highest salary, that the check swelled to 30. That design was deliberate. Pensions were built to be backloaded, to chain you to the building. And it worked. Hold on to that because we're going to come back to what it cost. All right, let's answer the simplest question. What is $30,000 from 1990 worth in today's money? Now, inflation just means the slow shrinking of what a dollar buys. Picture the same grocery cart in 1990 and today. Milk, bread, eggs, a tank of gas, the electric bill, and a stack of receipts that keeps getting more expensive with every decade. Prices creep up, so the same dollar covers less every year. Since 1990, prices in America have gone up about 156%. That's an average of roughly 2.5% a year, compounding for 36 years. Run the numbers, and Walter's $30,000 pension is equal to about $77,000 a year in today's money. So already, and this is the first thing that should surprise you, that modest pension from the break room party is the equivalent of a $77,000 a year income today. And here's a comparison that puts it in perspective. The median household income for Americans 65 and older right now is about $56,600 for the whole household, all sources combined, which means Walter's pension alone, translated to today, out-earns the typical American retiree household by more than $20,000 a year. And again, that was before you added his Social Security on top. But let me be straight with you, the way I always try to be. 77,000 is not 100,000. If we stopped right here, the title would be overselling it, and I won't do that. Pure inflation gets us to 77. So where does the rest come from? It comes from this. Walter's pension was never just a number. It was a bundle of things that have since disappeared, and those things are worth real money. 4 of them. The first thing Walter's pension carried is the one that's hardest to put a price on, and the most valuable of all. It was guaranteed for life, no matter what. Think about what that actually means. That check came on the first of the month whether the stock market soared or crashed. It came in 2000 when the tech bubble burst. It came in 2008 when the financial world nearly fell apart. It came during every scary headline of the last 36 years, and Walter never once had to look at a statement or rebalance anything, or wonder whether he should sell. It also came when he turned 90. And 95. The check did not care how long he lived, which means Walter carried zero risk of outliving his money. Zero. Now, I want to slow down here, because there's a specific danger Walter was immune to that most people have never heard of, and it's the single best argument for why a guaranteed check beats a pile of money. It's called sequence of returns risk. In plain English, when you're living off a portfolio, it's not just what returns you get that matters, it's the order you get them in. Picture 2 retirees at 2 different kitchen tables, both opening their first retirement statements. Both start with $1 million. Both pull out $60,000 a year to live on. And here's the key. Both experience exactly the same 10 years of market returns, averaging 9% a year. Identical average. Identical withdrawals. The only difference is the order the good and bad years arrive in. Retiree A gets the bad years first. A few losses right at the start, then the good years. After 10 years, he's got about $900,000 left. Retiree B gets the very same returns in reverse. The good years first, the bad ones later. After 10 years, she's got about $1,446,000. Same average return. Same spending. A gap of over $546,000 created by nothing but luck of the draw on the order. That's sequence of returns risk. When you're withdrawing money, losing early is devastating, because you're selling shares at the bottom and they're never there to recover. And you don't get to choose. It's the year you happen to retire. Walter was completely immune to all of it. He didn't have a sequence. He had a promise, and that is worth a very great deal. The second thing is that many pensions of that era, particularly public sector ones and a good number of union plans, came with something called a cost of living adjustment, a COLA. It simply means the check grows a little each year to keep pace with rising prices. That's a bigger deal than it sounds, And it's actually what our $77,000 figure assumes. Picture Walter at the grocery store year after year. The price of eggs rises, gas rises, insurance rises, and the pension check rises too. If Walter's pension had a COLA, then his $30,000 in 1990 grew year after year into roughly $77,000 today. And it bought him the same groceries, the same gas, the same life for 36 straight years. His purchasing power never eroded, not by a dime. Think about how rare that is. Almost nothing else in a retiree's life works that way. Your savings don't automatically rise with prices. Your annuity payment usually doesn't. The only other thing most Americans have that keeps pace with inflation is Social Security, which is precisely why Social Security is so much more valuable than people realize. Now hold that thought, because I promised honesty, and this one cuts both ways. Many private pensions had no COLA at all, and that changes everything. We'll come back to it, and it's important. And here's the third piece, the one almost everybody forgets, and it's enormous. Back in Walter's day, the pension usually came with the health insurance attached. In 1988, about 66% of large employers offered health benefits to their retirees. 2 out of 3. It was simply part of the deal. You retired and your medical coverage came with you. Today, that number has collapsed to about 24% of large employers. And in the private sector, it's nearly extinct. One study found only about 3% of private sector establishments still offer health benefits to Medicare-age retirees. 3%. So the thing that came standard with Walter's retirement is now something today's retiree pays for entirely out of pocket. Let's price it, because it's not small. Picture a retired couple at the dining table sorting Medicare paperwork, supplement bills, prescription receipts, and dental invoices into separate piles. A retired couple today pays Medicare Part B premiums. That's about $4,870 a year for the two of them. A Medicare supplement to cover the gaps, maybe another $4,800. A drug plan, around $960. And dental, vision, and hearing, which Medicare doesn't cover at all. Call it $1,500. Add it up, and you're at roughly $12,100 a year, just to have the coverage Walter got for free, as part of the package. So now stack it up. $77,000 of inflation-adjusted income, plus $12,000 of health coverage he didn't have to buy. And Walter's modest $30,000 pension is really worth about $89,000 a year in today's terms. And we still haven't priced the guarantee. There's a fourth piece, and it matters more to this audience than almost anything else I've said, because it's about what happens to the one who's left. When Walter retired, he made a choice most people today never get to make. He could take the biggest possible check for himself, which stops the day he dies, or he could take a slightly smaller check that keeps paying his wife for the rest of her life after he's gone. That's called a joint and survivor option. And Walter took it. His check was a bit lower, and when Walter passed at 84, his wife kept receiving a check every single month until she died 9 years later. Think about what that did. It meant that the most dangerous financial moment in a couple's life, the death of a spouse, didn't financially destroy her. We've talked before about the widow's cliff. When one spouse dies, the household loses a whole Social Security check. The survivor's tax brackets shrink by half, and yet most of the bills stay exactly the same. Walter's pension was built to soften that blow. It was, in effect, life insurance that never expired. Today's 401k has a version of this. Your spouse inherits the account, but it's a pile, not a promise. She inherits the balance, and with it, all the risk. The market risk, the longevity risk, the job of managing it, often at 78 years old and grieving. Walter's wife inherited a check that showed up on the first of the month and asked nothing of her. That's a fundamentally different kind of protection, and it doesn't show up on any statement. All right, here's the number I promised. Let's ask the real question, the one Danny is actually facing. Not what's the inflation equivalent, but what would it cost today to buy what Dad had? To walk into a financial company and purchase a guaranteed check for life. For both you and your spouse, that never stops and never fails. There's a product that does exactly that. It converts a lump sum into a guaranteed lifetime income. I'm not recommending it. I'm using it as a yardstick because it's the only honest way to price a promise. At today's rates, a couple aged 65 buying guaranteed lifetime income gets a payout of roughly 6.5% a year on the money they hand over. So run it. To buy that $89,000 a year of guaranteed lifetime income, Danny would need to hand over about $1,400,000, $1.4 million gone, in exchange for the check. And it gets worse because that version doesn't grow with inflation. It's a flat check forever. Remember, Walters had a COLA. To buy income that also rises with prices the way his did, you're looking at roughly $2 million. And if Danny wanted to fund that $89,000 out of a regular investment portfolio instead, following the common rule of thumb that says withdraw about 4% a year, he'd need about $2,200,000 saved. And even then, he doesn't get Walters' guarantee. He gets a probability. So there it is. Walters' breakroom pension, the one nobody in that room was impressed by, was the equivalent of handing him somewhere between $1.5 million and $2 million on his last day of work. Nobody said that out loud. There was no announcement. There was sheet cake. And Walter drove home thinking he'd gotten a fine, ordinary deal, never knowing he'd been handed a fortune. So let's answer the title's question directly, because I said I'd hold myself to it. Pure inflation gets us to $77,000. Add the health coverage that came in the box, and we're at $89,000. So how do I justify saying it beat $100,000 a year today? Here's why, and it's the subtlest point in this whole story. A guaranteed dollar and a portfolio dollar are not the same dollar. If Danny has a portfolio throwing off $100,000 a year, he cannot actually relax and spend $100,000 a year. He has to hold back a reserve for a bad market. He has to spend cautiously in the early years because, as we just saw, a crash right after you retire can permanently wreck a portfolio. He has to leave a cushion in case he lives to 98. He has to pay someone to manage it, or manage it himself, into his 80s through his own decline. And in a scary year, he has to live with the fear, which causes an awful lot of retirees to underspend and deny themselves for decades. Walter had to do exactly none of that. He could spend every single dollar of his check, every single month, with total confidence because there was always another one coming. So $100,000 of anxious, self-managed, market-exposed portfolio income genuinely does not buy the life that $89,000 of guaranteed, worry-free health coverage included, widow-protecting pension money bought. That's the gap. The certainty itself is worth something, and once you count it, yes, Walter's $30,000 beat $100,000 today. Now, here's a piece of history almost nobody knows, and it's got a terrible irony sitting right in the middle of it. In December of 1990, the same year Walter walked out with his gold watch, an accounting board most Americans have never heard of issued a rule with the thrilling name of Financial Accounting Standard 106. And in plain English, here's what it did. Before that rule, a company promising health coverage to its retirees could simply pay the bills as they came in each year and never write down what the whole promise would eventually cost. The obligation was real, but it was invisible. It didn't appear anywhere on the books. FAS 106 ended that. It forced companies to add up what they'd promised every current and future retiree and put that entire number on the balance sheet as a liability right where investors could see it. And when they did the arithmetic, the numbers were staggering. Major corporations suddenly reported enormous losses, not because anything had changed in the real world, but because a promise that had always been there was finally being written down. And then the predictable thing happened. Companies looked at that giant new number on their books and started cutting. Analysts call it the triggering event for the collapse of retiree health coverage, and the data agrees the steepest drop from that 66% came between 1988 and 1991. Right then, Walter walked out the door in 1990, and the door closed behind him. The pension itself was already being squeezed by the same logic, plus something else. Back in 1978, Congress had tucked a small provision into a tax bill, Section 401, Paragraph K, that was intended as a modest way for executives to defer some bonus money. Nobody meant to remake American retirement with it, but by the 80s, companies had realized this obscure little subsection could replace the pension entirely and shift the entire burden onto workers. The 401k was, in a very real sense, an accident that ate the pension. So there was never a vote. There was no announcement. The most valuable asset a middle-class family could own was dismantled by an accounting rule and a footnote in a tax code, and hardly anyone noticed it happening. Now, I have to push back hard on my own argument, because nostalgia is a liar, and I won't sell you a rose-colored 1990. Start with the biggest one. Many pensions had no COLA. Everything I showed you assumed Walter's check grew with inflation. Plenty of private pensions didn't do that at all. They paid a flat frozen number for life. And a flat check is devastating over a long retirement. Watch what happens to a fixed $30,000 pension with no COLA. After 10 years, it buys what $23,000 used to. After 20 years, about $17,800. And after 30 years, that $30,000 check is buying what less than $14,000 bought on the day he retired. It lost more than half its power while the number on the check never moved. So a great many pensioners from that era watched their secure retirement slowly starve, and they felt every year of it. The golden pension was mostly a public sector and union story. Plenty of private ones were not golden at all. Second, pensions could fail. Companies went bankrupt, plans got frozen, cut, or terminated. Picture a factory gate chained shut, a company sign coming down, and retirees opening letters that say the plan they counted on is changing. There's a federal backstop, the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, that steps in when a plan collapses, but it has limits, and plenty of retirees ended up with less than they were promised. Guaranteed was never quite as absolute as the word suggests. Third, remember that formula. The pension had a hidden price, and the price was your freedom. That deal required Walter to stay at one company for 30 years. Watch what leaving early actually cost. Say he'd left at year 15, when he was earning $32,000. 15 years times 2% times that $32,000 salary, that's a pension of about $9,600 a year, half the career. But less than a third of the check. That's the backloading doing its work. So a whole generation stayed in jobs they'd outgrown, in towns they wanted to leave, under bosses they couldn't stand, because walking away meant forfeiting their retirement. We remember the security. We forget that the security had a leash on it. Fourth, let me say something fair about the 401k, because I've been rough on it. It's yours. It's portable. Change jobs as often as you like and it comes with you, which suits how people actually work now. It can be inherited by your kids, which a pension check usually can't. When Walter and his wife were both gone, that check simply stopped, and the family got nothing. It can grow far beyond what a pension formula would have paid, and it gives you control and flexibility Walter never had. The 401k isn't a scam. It's a different trade, more upside and freedom, in exchange for carrying all the risk yourself. And finally, 1990 was not paradise. Mortgage rates were around 10%. Walter had lived through the brutal inflation of the 70s that terrified everyone. Every era hands you a different set of problems. The point of this story isn't that the past was better. It's that one specific thing, guaranteed lifetime income with healthcare attached, was worth a fortune, and it's gone, and almost nobody noticed it leave. Here's a practical warning that follows directly from everything we've just calculated, and it's one of the most useful things I can tell you. If you have a pension, there's a real chance that someday, maybe already, a letter arrives offering you a one-time lump sum to give it up. Companies do this deliberately. The industry calls it de-risking, which is a polite way of saying they'd like that promise off their books. And the offer will look enormous. $250,000, $300,000 in one check. Now you know how to think about that. You've just watched us price what a guaranteed lifetime check is actually worth. And remember, buying $89,000 a year of it costs well over $1 million. So when someone offers you a lump sum, the only question that matters is this offer anywhere close to what it would cost me to buy this income back? Very often it isn't. That's rather the point. The company is making the offer because it's a good deal for them. And understand what you'd be taking on. Accept the lump sum, and you have just volunteered for every single risk we talked about. Sequence of returns risk, longevity risk, the job of managing that money into your 90s, and the very real risk of fraud or bad advice. A big lump sum in an older person's account attracts people who'd like some of it. There are genuine reasons to take a buyout. If your former employer looks financially shaky and your benefit sits above the federal backstop's limits, if you're in poor health and don't expect a long retirement, if you have no spouse to protect, and a strong desire to leave money to your kids. Those are real, but they're the exception. For most people, that letter is asking you to sell the single most valuable thing you own, at a discount, to someone who knows exactly what it's worth. Before you sign anything, take it to a fee-only advisor, one who doesn't earn a commission on what you decide, and have them price the promise you'd be giving up. Step back, and here's what really happened between Walter's retirement party and Danny's. For most of the last century, retirement rested on what people called a three-legged stool: Social Security, a pension, and your own savings. Then, over about 30 years, the middle leg got kicked out and replaced with a 401k. And that swap did something profound that nobody put in a press release. It moved all the risk from the company's shoulders onto yours. The risk of a market crash, the risk of living a long time, the risk of guessing wrong. Walter's employer promised him a check and took on the job of making sure it arrived for the rest of his life. Danny's employer handed him a pile and wished him luck. And you can see the scale of it in the numbers. Around 60% of private sector workers had a traditional pension in the early 1980s. Today it's about 14%. And only about a quarter of all workers have access to one, with the vast majority of those being public employees: teachers, firefighters, city workers, the military. That's the whole story of American retirement in one statistic. The most valuable financial asset a middle-class family could own, a guaranteed check for life, went from ordinary to nearly extinct in a single generation, and it happened so gradually that there was never a day to notice it. So let's bring it home, because this isn't a history lesson. If you have a pension, if you're a retired teacher, a retired city worker, a veteran, a union tradesman, or you married one, I want you to understand what you're actually holding. You are not the person who didn't save much. You are holding an asset that, priced honestly, could be worth $1 million or more, and you probably never once put it on a balance sheet. Value it. Protect it. Understand your survivor options cold, because what happens to your spouse when you're gone is one of the most important decisions attached to it. And it's usually a one-time, irreversible choice made at retirement. Find out whether yours has a COLA, because that single feature is the difference between the pension that stays golden and the one that slowly starves. And if that buyout letter ever comes, you now know exactly what you'd be selling. If you don't have a pension, hear this clearly. You are not behind, and you did not fail. You were handed a fundamentally harder job than your parents were, with less help, and no one ever told you that out loud. The most useful thing you can do is understand that guaranteed income is the thing that made their retirement feel so secure. And then ask yourself, how much of your income is guaranteed? For most people, Social Security is the only guaranteed inflation-adjusted lifelong check they will ever have, which is exactly why the decision of when to claim it, and every dollar you can add to it by waiting, matters more than any other financial move you will ever make. You can't get Walter's pension back, but you can build the closest thing to it that still exists. So, was a $30,000 pension in 1990 worth more than $100,000 today? Now you know the honest answer. Inflation alone says $77,000. Add back the health coverage that came in the box, and it's $89,000. Add the fact that every dollar was guaranteed, spendable, immune to the market, and still there for his widow after he was gone. And yes, it beat $100,000 a year. And to buy it outright today would take somewhere between $1.5 million and $2 million. Walter never knew any of that. He thought he'd gotten a decent deal for 30 years of showing up. He'd have been genuinely stunned to hear that the modest thing they handed him over sheet cake in a break room on an ordinary Friday in 1990 was the most valuable financial asset he would ever own, and that an accounting rule signed that very December would help make sure his son could never have one. And that's really the lesson for all of us. The most valuable things in a retirement are almost never the ones that look impressive. They're the plain ones: the guaranteed check, the paid-off house, the coverage that's simply handled, the freedom from having to worry, and the promise that outlives you and takes care of the person you love.